enunciations. So this is interesting because we should move here away from the kinds of examples which we find in the criminal law, I think, for a moment, just to test out the moral thought. So suppose you promise to have lunch with somebody at 12 tomorrow and to show up at the social sciences building at 5 to 12 to meet them. All right? Now, it seems to be quite likely that if you promise to do something, you have a duty to do it. I'm not going to try and defend that proposition now, but that seems to me to be the importance of promising, that it gives you a duty to do something. And so the question is, in that case, do you have a duty to show up tomorrow at 5 to 12, like you promised? Does your promise give rise to that duty? And is that different from promising to do your best to show up at 5 to 12 tomorrow? In other words, does the person who says, yes, I'll be there, 5 to 12, promise something different from the person who says, well, yeah, probably, but you have to see if I make it? Are those different promises? All right? Because if they're different promises, that's because they yield different duties. And if they yield different duties, that shows that in morality, as in law, there can be duties that contain an element of achievement, actually being there, and duties that don't, that only engage with endeavor. Right? If such things can be promised, then such things can be made duties. And if they can be made duties, then they can be made duties by the law too. And the distinction between the two kinds of duties can equally be recognized. So I think this is, I'm not going to try and present you with a very long and dull and elaborate and technical defense I've given of the proposition that those two duties are different duties and can both exist in morality and can be contrasted morally, and that it's possible to breach one and not to breach the other, and therefore to commit a wrong by not turning up, which is different from the wrong that one commits by not trying hard enough to turn up. That those are both possible wrongs, and that they're different wrongs. But if you're with me on that, then you should be with me on the thought that the way our actions turn out can make a difference to their wrongness. And that there's no, as it were, conceptual objection to the law finding examples of that as well. No conceptual objection to the criminal law finding such examples. Since there can be such examples of such contrasting examples in morality, there's space for the law to make use of the contrast. That's conceptual space. You might still have some moral worries about the criminal law doing this, right? These are worries about whether the criminal law, maybe any part of the law, but at any rate the criminal law should help itself to the distinction. And so once we've got past the conceptual worries, we might still have a fight on our hands. Is it a good idea for the law to distinguish successful criminals from attempted criminals, to distinguish those who kill by accident from those who merely endanger? It's a good idea on moral grounds, given that that distinction makes sense. Well, that turns on a lot of other considerations. One thing that often people worry about is an aspect of the principle of legality, or the rule of law. They often worry about this in this context. They say, well, it's part of the rule of law that you should be able to work out ex ante which crime you're going to be guilty of before you set about doing the thing that may yield a liability. And here we have a rule of law problem, right? Because as you're driving obliviously along this, well, let's assume that in spite of your obliviousness, you are still au fait with the Road Traffic Act. But you can't tell, right, which of the two crimes you're about to commit. You can't tell that, and that's a worry, some people think, from the point of view of the principle of legality or the rule of law. You haven't been put on enough warning. Now, although I was very worried about the principle of legality in connection with the problem raised by the Harts, I'm a lot more relaxed about the principle of legality here. I don't think it has the implication that some people say it has. I don't think it's true that you must be put on warning of the very crime that you're about to commit in the way that this story suggests you must. It seems to me quite all right that the law puts you on warning in the following rather different way. It creates a conduct crime of assault, say. And it makes the further liability for results turn on the prior, or partly constitutive in prior, commission of the crime of assault. And the crime of assault is defined in a way that allows you to know that you're about to commit it. This seems to me to be the main way in which the law copes with the legality objection. It creates a sort of threshold condition that you have to pass before you are liable for consequences that would otherwise, consequences, I should say now, results, because that's the terminology I'm using, results that would otherwise not be suitable grounds for criminality. It's not the only way the law copes, but it's one. But notice, the most important thing I'm trying to say is that's not really a very deep problem compared to the other one. The really deep problem is the problem of whether there can be moral distinctions between success and attempt, between failure and inadequate endeavor. Whether these distinctions exist in morality such that it's intelligible for the law to repeat them. Once we've got there, we can face up to what I think of as the institutional problems about when the law should do that, given the law's function to regulate society in accordance with the rule of law. And so I'd like to suggest that there are really three questions floating around. One of them is the one that I discarded early on, which was the one that Jennifer and Hart referred to. Should the further consequences of crimes be relevant to sentencing when they're not mentioned in the definition of the crime? The second was the conceptual question: can the results of our actions make a difference to which wrong we commit? I gave you the example of the promises, the different promises, to test out your intuitions on that. And the third question, if that's so, if there can be a distinction between different kinds of wrongs constitutionally in these two different ways, should the law, especially the criminal law, resort to drawing those distinctions for the purposes of charging and prosecuting offenders? That's all I wanted to say.
Thanks very much, Professor Gardner. In Oxford, those who set the questions are not those who provide the grades in the end. So
someone will.